Thunder rumbled across the Montana sky as Lila Nelson checked the roof of her cabin for leaks, hoping the wood she'd gathered would be enough to get her through the coming storm. It was 1874, and living alone on the outskirts of Whitefish, Montana, wasn't what she had planned for herself at 22. But life had a way of upending even the most carefully laid plans. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets as Lila hurried back inside, grateful for the sturdy walls of the cabin her father had built before pneumonia took him last winter. She stoked the fire and settled into her mother's rocking chair, the only piece of furniture she'd managed to salvage from their family home in Illinois before moving west. The drumming of rain on the roof was oddly comforting as she opened her journal and began to write. "Another spring storm coming," she wrote, her handwriting neat and precise. "The mountains look angry today. Mr. Hargrove from town says this is unusual weather, even for Montana." Lila paused her writing when a strange sound caught her attention, a deep, unsettling groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself. She set her journal aside and moved to the window, peering out into the darkening afternoon. The rain had turned the dirt around her cabin into thick mud, and something didn't feel right. Another sound, like distant thunder but more sustained, made her pulse quicken. When the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, Lila knew with sudden, terrible clarity what was happening. "The mountain," she whispered. She lunged for the door, but it was too late. With a deafening roar, the side of the mountain came loose in a torrent of mud, rock, and debris. Lila barely had time to dive beneath the sturdy oak table before the wall of her cabin splintered inward. She screamed as mud and rocks poured through the breach, the terrible weight of the mountain bearing down. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the ceiling collapsing, burying her world in earth and timber. 10 miles away, Kyle Tucker guided his horse along the rain-soaked trail toward town. At 26, he'd spent the last 8 years working cattle drives and breaking horses across 3 territories, but had finally settled in Whitefish, taking work at the Double Diamond Ranch. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead beneath his wide-brimmed hat, but he paid it little mind. He was used to worse. He'd been sent to town for supplies, but the storm had delayed him. Now, as thunder rumbled and lightning split the sky, Kyle noticed something strange about the mountain ridge in the distance. Where there had once been a line of pines, there was now a great gash of exposed earth. "What in the world?" he muttered, reining his horse to a stop. As he watched, more earth slipped away, cascading down the mountainside. Kyle knew there were a few homesteads scattered in that direction. Without hesitation, he turned his horse and spurred it forward, riding hard toward the landslide. By the time Kyle reached the area, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the devastation was unmistakable. A massive section of the mountain had given way, sending tons of rock and mud downhill. As he rode along the edge of the slide, his heart sank. If anyone had been in the path of this destruction, their chances were slim. He might have ridden past the half-buried cabin if not for a flash of blue fabric caught on a splintered beam. Kyle dismounted quickly, tying his horse to a still-standing tree before making his way carefully across the unstable ground. What he found made his blood run cold. A small cabin, or what remained of it, lay crushed beneath the slide. Only a corner of the roof and part of one wall were visible above the mud and debris. "Hello," Kyle called out, not expecting an answer. "Anyone in there?" The silence was broken only by the dripping of rainwater. He was about to turn away when he heard it faint but unmistakable a moan from within the buried structure. "Hold on," he shouted. "I'm coming." Without a second thought, Kyle began to dig, using his bare hands to claw away the mud and lift stones. He worked frantically, shoving aside debris and calling out reassurances every few minutes. The work was brutal. Rocks sliced his palms and mud caked beneath his fingernails, but he didn't stop. "Please," he murmured as he worked, "just hold on." Hours passed. Kyle's hands were raw and bleeding, his muscles screaming in protest, but he kept digging. Night had fallen, and he worked by the light of a hastily made torch stuck in the ground beside him. Finally, he uncovered what remained of the cabin door and forced it open. Inside, the space was devastatingly small. Most of the cabin had been crushed. But in the corner, protected by the heavy oak table that had somehow withstood the weight of the collapse, was a woman. Her face was pale beneath a layer of dirt, a streak of blood trailing from her temple, but she was alive. "Can you hear me?" Kyle asked, kneeling beside her. Lila's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with fear. "The mountain," she whispered hoarsely. "It came down." "Yes, madam, it did," Kyle said gently. "But you're alive, and I'm going to get you out of here." He worked carefully to free her from the debris, relieved to find that though she was bruised and battered, no bones appeared to be broken. When he finally lifted her from the ruins of her home, Lila clung to him, too weak to stand. "My name's Kyle Tucker," he said. "I work at the Double Diamond. What's yours?" "Lila Nelson," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for finding me." Kyle carried Lila to his horse and carefully helped her into the saddle before mounting behind her. As they rode toward town, Lila drifted in and out of consciousness, leaning back against Kyle's chest. "Everything I had was in that cabin," she murmured once. "We'll figure something out," Kyle promised, though he had no idea what. By the time they reached Whitefish, Lila was feverish. Kyle took her straight to Doc Wilson's house, pounding on the door until the sleepy physician answered. "Landslide," Kyle explained tersely as the doctor ushered them inside. "Found her buried in her cabin." Doc Wilson, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, quickly examined Lila while Kyle waited anxiously in the front room, his raw, bleeding hands forgotten until the doctor's wife noticed them and insisted on cleaning and bandaging them. "She's lucky to be alive," Doc Wilson said when he finally emerged. "She's got a concussion, some nasty bruises, and she's inhaled a fair bit of dust, which has her lungs irritated, but she'll recover with rest and care." "She said the cabin was everything she had," Kyle said. "Where will she go?" The doctor and his wife exchanged glances. "We can keep her here a few days," Mrs. Wilson said, "but our spare room is spoken for next week when our daughter's family visits." Kyle nodded, his mind racing. "I'll figure something out." He returned the next day after explaining the situation to his boss at the Double Diamond. Mr. Holloway was a fair man and gave Kyle 3 days to help the woman he'd rescued. When Kyle arrived at the doctor's house, he found Lila sitting up in bed, some color returned to her cheeks. "Mr. Tucker," she said, offering a small smile. "Dr. Wilson said you dug for hours to find me." Kyle shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Lila countered softly, noticing his bandaged hands. "Your hands, they said you dug until they bled." "They'll heal," Kyle replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Lila said, though her voice was still raspy. "But I don't know what I'm going to do. Everything I owned was in that cabin." Kyle pulled a chair closer to her bedside. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Nelson. You have family we could contact." Lila shook her head. "My father passed last winter, my mother years before. I came west with Pa after the war, but now—" Her voice trailed off. Kyle nodded, understanding the unspoken reality of her situation. A young woman alone in the West faced limited options, none particularly appealing. "I've spoken with Mrs. Jennings at the boarding house," he said. She's agreed to give you a room for 2 weeks, my treat, while you recover and figure out your next steps. Lila's eyes widened. That's very generous, but I can't accept. You can and you will, Kyle interrupted firmly. Consider it a loan if you must. You can repay me once you're back on your feet. Though clearly uncomfortable with the charity, Lila eventually agreed. 3 days later, when she was strong enough to leave the doctor's care, Kyle escorted her to the boarding house, carrying the small bundle of donated clothing that the doctor's wife had collected for her. Mrs. Jennings, a plump, cheerful widow, welcomed Lila warmly and showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. The bathhouse is out back, she explained. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, though you can receive visitors in the parlor until 8 in the evening. After Mrs. Jennings left them alone in the parlor, Kyle shifted awkwardly. I have to get back to the ranch tomorrow, but I'll check on you when I can. Lila looked up at him, her blue eyes troubled. Why are you helping me, Mr. Tucker? You don't even know me. Kyle considered the question seriously. Out here, people have to look out for each other. Besides, anyone who survives being buried alive deserves a helping hand. Lila smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed her face and caught Kyle off guard with its warmth. Well, Mr. Tucker, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons. Kyle tipped his hat. Get some rest, Miss Nelson. Things will look brighter soon. Over the next 2 weeks, Kyle rode into town whenever he could, checking on Lila and bringing news. On his 3rd visit, he found her in the general store, where she'd taken a position behind the counter. Mr. Hayes is paying me enough to cover the room at Mrs. Jennings, she explained as she arranged a display of fabric. It's not much, but it's a start. Kyle noticed the dark circles under her eyes had faded, and her hands moved with purpose as she worked. That's good news, he said, genuinely pleased. I've been thinking about what to do next, Lila continued. I can't stay at the boarding house forever, but building a new cabin is out of the question right now. Kyle leaned against the counter. What about working at one of the ranches? Several need help with cooking and such. Lila considered this. Perhaps, though most prefer to hire married women. An awkward silence fell between them. Kyle cleared his throat. Well, I should let you get back to work. I just wanted to make sure you were getting along all right. As he turned to leave, Lila called after him. Mr. Tucker, he paused, looking back. Would you join me for supper at the boarding house tonight? Mrs. Jennings said I could have a guest, and well, I'd like to thank you properly for saving my life. Kyle felt an unexpected warmth spread through him. I'd be honored, Miss Nelson. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Kyle found himself increasingly drawn to Lila. She spoke of her childhood in Illinois, her father's dreams of striking it rich in Montana, and the quiet life they'd built on the edge of the wilderness. In turn, Kyle told her about growing up in Texas, riding with cattle drives from a young age, and his hopes of saving enough to buy his own small spread someday. It gets lonely sometimes, Lila admitted as they sat in the boarding house parlor after dinner. I loved my father dearly, but since he passed, I've had little company besides my own thoughts. I understand that, Kyle said. The trail can be a lonely place too, even surrounded by other men. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. As spring turned to summer, Kyle's visits to town became more frequent. He'd finish his work at the ranch early, then ride the 10 miles to Whitefish just to spend an hour with Lila before returning. Sometimes they would walk along the edge of the lake. Other times simply sit on the boarding house porch and talk, until Mrs. Jennings called Lila in for the night. Rumors began to circulate about the Cowboy and the Landslide survivor, but neither paid them much mind. Kyle found in Lila a quiet strength that impressed him, while Lila discovered that beneath Kyle's rough exterior was a thoughtful, honorable man. On a warm July evening, as they walked by the lake, Kyle finally spoke of something that had been on his mind. "Mr. Holloway offered me a foreman position," he said, "starting this fall." "Kyle, that's wonderful," Lila exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. They had progressed to first names weeks ago. "It means more money," he continued, "and a cabin of my own on the property." Lila nodded, trying to ignore the twinge of sadness at the thought that a promotion might mean seeing less of him. "It's a good-sized cabin," Kyle added, his voice oddly hesitant. "2 rooms." "That sounds nice," Lila said, not understanding his meaning. Kyle stopped walking and turned to face her. "Lila, I'm not good with words or grand speeches, but these past few months, getting to know you." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is that cabin would be mighty empty with just me in it." Lila's heart began to race as she realized what he was suggesting. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Kyle Tucker?" she said softly. He took her hands in his palms now calloused but healed from that desperate night of digging. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming Mrs. Tucker and sharing that cabin with me. I know it's not much to offer, but—" "Yes," Lila interrupted, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, I would consider it. In fact, I've already considered it quite thoroughly." Kyle's face broke into a broad smile. "You have?" Lila nodded. "I've been half in love with you since you pulled me from that buried cabin, and fully in love with you since our 3rd walk by this lake." Kyle pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a landslide," he murmured. Lila laughed. "Nor I, though I could have done without being buried alive." The wedding was a simple affair, held in early September at the small church in Whitefish. Mrs. Jennings hosted a modest reception at the boarding house, where the townsfolk who had come to know and care for Lila gathered to wish the couple well. "To think," Mrs. Hayes from the general store remarked, "if Kyle hadn't ridden by when he did, we might never have known what happened to you, dear Lila." "Some might call it fate," Doc Wilson added. "I call it providence." Whatever it was, Kyle and Lila embraced their new life together with gratitude. The foreman's cabin at the Double Diamond was indeed small but cozy, and Lila transformed it into a home with her deft touch. She planted a garden, hung curtains, and filled the place with small comforts that made Kyle wonder how he'd ever lived without them or her. As autumn painted the mountains gold and crimson, Kyle came home one evening to find Lila sitting by the fire, a secretive smile on her face. "What's that look for?" he asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "I received a letter today," she said, "from a lawyer in Illinois." Kyle frowned, concerned. "Bad news." "Quite the opposite," Lila replied, holding out the letter. "Do you remember me telling you about my mother's brother, Uncle James, the one who went to California during the gold rush?" Kyle nodded, taking the letter. "The one your father always said was fools crazy for leaving a perfectly good farm." "The very same," Lila confirmed. "Well, it seems Uncle James wasn't so foolish after all. He did find gold, and quite a bit of it. He passed away last month, and having no children of his own, he left everything to me, his only living relative." Kyle's eyes widened as he read the letter. "Lila, this says, this is a considerable sum." "Enough to buy our own land," Lila said softly, "if that's still what you want." Kyle looked up from the letter, his expression serious. "Is that what you want? After what happened with the landslide, I'd understand if you wanted to move somewhere flatter." Lila rose and crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Kyle Tucker, I want to be wherever you are. But yes, I'd like a place of our own, perhaps not quite so close to the mountain this time." Kyle laughed and lifted her off her feet in a joyous embrace. "Mrs. Tucker, I believe we're about to become landowners." By spring of 1875, they had purchased 100 acres of good land about 5 miles outside of Whitefish, far enough from the mountains to be safe from landslides, but close enough to enjoy their majestic beauty. They built a sturdy house with a wide porch and enough rooms for the family they both hoped to have. One evening, as they sat on that porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Lila took Kyle's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I think our family is starting sooner rather than later," she said softly. Kyle's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as he understood her meaning. "Are you certain?" Lila nodded, her eyes shining. "Doc Wilson confirmed it yesterday. Come winter, there will be 3 of us." Kyle pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with emotion. "I never thought I could be this happy," he admitted, his voice rough with feeling. "Nor I," Lila whispered against his chest. "Especially not that day the mountain came down." They held each other as darkness fell, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had grown from tragedy. Their son, Samuel James Tucker, was born on a cold January night in 1876, with Doc Wilson in attendance and a nervous Kyle pacing outside the bedroom door. When the doctor finally invited him in to meet his son, Kyle found he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He simply stood beside the bed, looking down at his wife and child with awe. "He has your eyes," Lila said tiredly, smiling up at him. Kyle gently touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling when the little fingers curled around his own. "He has your spirit," he replied. "I can tell already." Life settled into a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. Kyle managed their growing ranch while Lila cared for Samuel and tended to their home. They added cattle, then horses, building a reputation for fair deals and quality stock. Kyle's experience as a foreman served him well in his new role as rancher, while Lila's practical nature and quick mind made her an ideal partner. In the summer of 1878, as they celebrated Samuel's 2nd birthday, a violent storm swept through the valley. Lightning struck a tree near their barn, setting it ablaze. Kyle and his ranch hands fought desperately to save the structure and the animals inside. Lila, watching from the house with Samuel clutched to her chest, felt a cold dread that reminded her of the day the mountain had buried her. When a section of the burning roof collapsed, trapping Kyle inside, she handed Samuel to their housekeeper and ran toward the inferno without hesitation. "Kyle," she screamed, pushing past the men who tried to hold her back. Through the smoke and flames, she saw him pinned beneath a beam, struggling to free himself. Without thought for her own safety, Lila rushed in, grabbing a nearby pitchfork to lever the beam enough for Kyle to pull free. Together, they stumbled out just as more of the roof gave way. "Are you mad?" Kyle coughed, his face blackened with soot. "You could have been killed." "As could you," Lila retorted, tears cutting clean tracks down her smoke-smudged face. "And then where would Samuel and I be?" Kyle pulled her close, his heart still racing from the near miss. "I suppose we're even now," he said, his voice hoarse. "You saved me this time." "And I would do it again," Lila whispered fiercely, "just as you did for me." They rebuilt the barn, larger and stronger than before. As they worked, Lila discovered she was expecting their 2nd child. Despite Kyle's concerns about her working during her pregnancy, she insisted on doing her part, though she agreed to less strenuous tasks. "You know," Kyle remarked one evening as they sat by the fire, Samuel asleep on his lap, "I've been thinking about what happened with the barn." "What about it?" Lila asked, looking up from her sewing. "You didn't hesitate," Kyle said. "You saw I was in trouble and came running, just like I did when I found your cabin buried." Lila set her needlework aside. "Of course I did. I love you." That's just it, Kyle continued, his expression thoughtful. I didn't even know you then, but I couldn't ride away. Something made me stop, made me dig until I found you. Providence, as Doc Wilson would say, Lila suggested. Kyle nodded slowly. Maybe so, or maybe some part of me already knew what you would come to mean to me. Their daughter, Elizabeth Grace Tucker, was born in the spring of 1879. A happy, healthy baby with her mother's blonde hair and her father's determined nature. As their family and ranch grew, so did their connection to the community. They hosted gatherings for neighboring ranchers, contributed to the building of a new schoolhouse in town, and offered help to newcomers struggling to establish themselves. One such newcomer was a young widow named Clara Harmon, who arrived in Whitefish with her 2 young children in the summer of 1880. Her husband had died on the journey west, leaving her alone to make a new start. When Lila heard of their situation, she insisted on offering the family temporary lodging in the guest cabin on their property. "It's what someone should have done for me," she explained to Kyle. "If you hadn't found me when you did." She didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew how easily her story could have ended beneath the debris of that landslide. Clara and her children stayed for 3 months, until she secured a position as the new school teacher and found a small house in town. Her friendship with Lila endured, and the 2 women often worked together on community projects. As their children grew, Kyle and Lila made a point of teaching them not just ranching skills, but also the importance of helping others. They told them the story of the landslide and the rescue, though softened for young ears. "Your pa is a hero," Lila would say, smiling at Kyle across the dinner table. "Your ma is the strongest woman I know," Kyle would counter. "She survived being buried alive." The story became something of a family legend, retold on birthdays and anniversaries. Samuel, in particular, loved hearing about his father digging through the landslide with his bare hands. "Would you have given up if you couldn't find her?" he asked once, when he was about 8. Kyle considered the question seriously. "No, son. Some things you don't give up on, no matter how hard they seem." "Like love?" Samuel asked, wiser than his years. "Especially love," Kyle agreed, catching Lila's eye across the room and sharing a smile. In 1884, a decade after the landslide that had brought them together, Kyle and Lila's ranch, which they had named Second Chance, had become one of the most prosperous in the region. They had added a 3rd child to their family, another son named Daniel Kyle, who at 5 years old was already showing signs of his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick wit. That spring, they received word that the railroad would be expanding through Whitefish, bringing new opportunities and challenges to the area. The news sparked debates among the local ranchers and townsfolk about progress versus tradition, growth versus preservation. "Things are changing," Kyle remarked as they discussed the railroad over breakfast. "Might be good for business, but I can't help wondering what it will mean for our way of life." Lila poured more coffee into his cup. "Change is inevitable. We of all people should know that life can turn upside down in an instant." Kyle nodded, thinking back to that rainy day when he'd spotted the gash in the mountainside. "I suppose you're right. We adapt or we get left behind." "We adapt," Lila agreed, "but we don't forget what matters most." What mattered most was reinforced later that year when Samuel fell from a horse and broke his arm badly. The local doctor did his best, but complications set in, and for a few terrifying days, it seemed the boy might lose his arm or worse. Kyle rode day and night to fetch a specialist from Helena, returning just in time. The surgeon was able to reset the bone properly and treat the infection that had taken hold. As Samuel recovered, both Kyle and Lila were reminded once again how precious and precarious life could be. I thought we might lose him, Lila confessed one night after the children were asleep, her face pressed against Kyle's shoulder as they sat on the porch swing. But we didn't, Kyle said firmly, his arm tightening around her. He's strong like his mother. And stubborn like his father, Lila added with a small smile. That too, Kyle acknowledged. Stubbornness has its uses. Got you out of that buried cabin, didn't it? Lila looked up at the night sky, at the stars scattered across the darkness. Sometimes I still have nightmares about being trapped there, she admitted. I wake up feeling like I can't breathe, like the weight of the mountain is pressing down on me again. Kyle pressed a kiss to her temple. You're safe now. We're all safe. And they were, though life continued to present its challenges. The railroad came, bringing with it new settlers, new businesses, and new tensions. The open range that had defined the West for generations began to disappear behind fence lines and property stakes. Kyle and Lila adapted, diversifying their ranch operations and investing in new technologies that made their work more efficient. "Pa, do you ever miss the old days?" Samuel asked on his 16th birthday in 1892 as they rode the fence line together. "Before all these changes." Kyle considered the question, looking out over the land he and Lila had built into something substantial over the years. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Things were simpler in some ways. But then, if the world hadn't been changing, I might never have ended up here. Might never have found your mother in that landslide." Samuel, now nearly as tall as his father and showing the same skill with horses, nodded thoughtfully. "I can't imagine you two not being together, the way you look at Ma even after all these years." Kyle smiled. "That's the secret, son. Finding someone worth looking at that way for a lifetime." By the turn of the century, Whitefish had transformed from a small frontier settlement to a proper town with a train station, several hotels, and even a small college. The Tucker Ranch had grown accordingly, now encompassing over 500 acres and employing a dozen full-time hands. Samuel, at 24, had married a spirited young woman named Rebecca and taken over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch. Elizabeth, 21, was studying to be a teacher at the college in Helena, returning home for holidays with stories of a changing world beyond the mountains. Daniel, at 19, showed a gift for business and helped Kyle navigate the increasingly complex commercial aspects of ranching in the new century. In the spring of 1904, 30 years after the landslide that had changed their lives, Kyle and Lila celebrated their anniversary by revisiting the site where her cabin had once stood. The scar on the mountainside had long since healed, covered now with new growth, though the outline of the slide was still visible to those who knew where to look. "I never thought we'd come back here," Lila said, dismounting from her horse with the grace of a woman who had spent decades in the saddle despite being 52. Kyle, his dark hair now streaked with silver but his back still straight at 56, stood beside her, taking her hand in his. Seemed fitting, somehow, to remember where it all began. They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in memories of that desperate day. Finally, Lila squeezed his hand. "You know, for years I wondered why I survived when so many others might not have," she said. "Why you happened to ride by just then, why you stopped to help a stranger." "And did you ever figure it out?" Kyle asked. Lila turned to face him, her blue eyes still bright in a face lined by years of sun and laughter. "I think some people are just meant to find each other, no matter what mountains stand in their way." Kyle smiled, pulling her close. "I'd dig through another landslide to find you, Lila Tucker, bleeding hands and all." "Let's hope that won't be necessary," Lila replied, resting her head against his chest. "I think we've had enough adventures for one lifetime." But life still had adventures in store. Later that year, Samuel and Rebecca welcomed twins, a boy and a girl, filling the ranch house with the sounds of a new generation. Elizabeth became engaged to a young lawyer she'd met in Helena, and Daniel announced his intention to expand the ranch's operations into breeding thoroughbred horses. Through it all, Kyle and Lila remained the steady center of the family, their bond forged in crisis and strengthened through decades of shared joys and sorrows. They watched as automobiles began to replace horses in town, as telephones connected distant ranches, as the world grew smaller and faster around them. "You ever regret it?" Kyle asked Lila one evening in 1910 as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Coming west with your father all those years ago, staying after the landslide." Lila, now approaching 60, shook her head. "Not for a moment. Everything that matters to me is here, you, our children, our grandchildren, the life we've built together." Kyle nodded, understanding. At 62, he had slowed somewhat, leaving more of the ranch work to Samuel and Daniel, but he still rode out most days, still felt most at home under the big Montana sky. "We've been lucky," he said, taking her hand in his. The scars from that long-ago rescue had faded to faint white lines, but they were still there, a permanent reminder of the day that had brought Lila into his life. "Luck had something to do with it," Lila agreed, "but so did determination. You could have given up digging that day, but you didn't." "Some things are worth bleeding for," Kyle said simply. They sat together as darkness fell, comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of shared understanding. Their story, which had begun in disaster, had unfolded into something beautiful, a testament to resilience, to second chances, to love that could withstand the weight of a mountain. In the years that followed, they watched as the world changed around them. The Great War came, taking some of Whitefish's young men, including 2 of their ranch hands, and forever changing those who returned. The Spanish flu swept through in 1918, sparing their immediate family but claiming friends and neighbors. Through it all, the Tucker Ranch remained a haven, a place of stability in uncertain times. Kyle and Lila, now in their 70s, gradually stepped back from active management, though they remained involved in family decisions and community matters. Their reputation for fairness and generosity had made them respected figures throughout the region. In 1924, for their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren organized a celebration that brought together nearly everyone in Whitefish and the surrounding areas. The event was held on the ranch, with tables set up under the trees and lanterns hanging from branches. 3 generations of Tuckers welcomed guests, told stories, and paid tribute to the couple whose love had started with a desperate rescue half a century earlier. 50 years, Kyle marveled quietly to Lila as they took a moment away from the festivities. "If someone had told me that day when I was digging through the mud that I'd spend 50 years with the woman I found, I wouldn't have believed it possible." Lila smiled, her face deeply lined but her eyes still bright. "Why not? You always were stubborn enough to make the impossible happen." Kyle laughed, the sound still rich despite his advanced years. "Only because you were worth finding, Lila Tucker." As the celebration continued around them, they stood together, watching their legacy unfold in the faces of their children, grandchildren, and now even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch would continue, the family would grow, the story would be passed down through generations. "Do you think they'll remember?" Lila asked softly. 100 years from now, will anyone remember how we found each other?" Kyle thought about this. "Maybe not the details," he admitted. "But I'd like to think they'll remember what matters, that love is worth fighting for, worth digging for, even when the odds seem impossible." Lila nodded, leaning against his side. "I think they will," and they did. Long after Kyle and Lila were gone, Kyle passing peacefully in his sleep in 1926 at age 78, Lila following just 6 months later. Unwilling to live without him, their story endured. It was told at family gatherings, whispered to children at bedtime, recounted at weddings and funerals and christenings. The tale of the landslide, the buried cabin, and the cowboy who dug until his hands bled became more than just a family legend. It became a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, that courage and determination can overcome even the most daunting obstacles, and that some bonds, once formed, can never be broken, not by hardship, not by time, not even by the weight of a mountain. On the 100th anniversary of the landslide, in 1974, the Tucker family, now spread across the country, but still connected to the ranch that had been in their family for generations, gathered in Whitefish to commemorate the event. They visited the mountainside, now completely healed, where Lila's cabin had once stood. They placed a small bronze plaque that simply read, "For Kyle and Lila Tucker, whose love story began here in 1874 when a landslide buried her cabin and he dug until his hands bled to find her. May we all be so fortunate to find someone worth digging for." And as the family stood there, some said they could almost feel the presence of Kyle and Lila, still together, still in love, still teaching future generations that some things, the most important things, are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The story of Kyle and Lila Tucker, the cowboy and the woman he rescued from a landslide, lives on a testament to the enduring power of love, courage, and second chances in a world that never stops changing, but always needs heroes willing to dig through mountains to save what matters most.